In this lesson, we're going to cover security information and event management systems. Now, log reviews are a critical part of security assurance, but to perform this effectively, we really need to first gather all of our logs from our different systems on our network and put them all into one place. Now, gathering your system logs is important, but gathering those logs will do you no good if you don't actually take time to look at those logs. Your logs should not just be reviewed after an incident occurs. Instead, you shouldn't just be using them as part of your incident response, but you should really be looking at those logs regularly and routinely as part of your alerting and monitoring activities. To do this effectively, though, you really do need to have them all in one place, and that is why we'll be using a SIEM. Now, a SIEM, or a Security Information and Event Management System, is a solution that provides real-time or near real-time analysis of your security alerts that are being generated by network hardware and applications. As we look at a SIEM, there's a lot of uses for them, but one of the best things that we use them for is to help us correlate all of these various events and logs and incidents into one central place. Now, let's pretend for a moment that you're working as a cybersecurity analyst or professional, and you've been asked to go over all the system logs to detect any kind of unusual activities. Now, as you begin to look through all those logs, you start seeing that somebody is logged in from a VPN from Asia using the account for Mr. John Smith. Now, if John Smith is one of our employees and he's currently on a business trip to Asia, then there's probably nothing wrong with him logging in using a VPN from Asia. But if you see another log entry just a few minutes later that shows John Smith's security badge was used to unlock the server room door in your data center located in New York City, this is a big issue because John Smith can't be in both the server room in New York City and connecting back to the network using a VPN from a hotel in Asia. These two things can't happen at the same time. So, based on these two log entries, we know that one of these two things is wrong, or suspicious, or malicious, but we don't know which one it is yet. Now, in this case, John is an authorized employee, so his logging into the VPN or going in and accessing the server room in itself is fine, but putting those two things together at the same time as being correlated within a short period of time flags them as something we need to look into further and investigate, because this person can't be in both places at the same time. Now, since these are two disparate systems, with one being the VPN system and one being the physical security system for your data center, you likely wouldn't have noticed this correlation across both sets of logs unless you were using a SIEM, which can then consolidate and correlate all of your system logs into the centralized database or repository, because with this SIEM, it's now relatively quick and easy for us to identify this type of impossible travel across both of these disparate systems. Now, another example might involve a large enterprise with a complex network infrastructure that includes multiple servers, databases, firewalls, and thousands upon thousands of workstations. This organization may deploy a SIEM system to monitor and analyze activities across all these devices for any kind of potential security threats too. And this is another place where a SIEM helps us out. Now, the SIEM will be able to collect log data from all these different disparate sources and aggregate it all together for analysis by a cybersecurity professional. The SIEM can then correlate and analyze this data to identify patterns that might indicate a security threat, such as repeated login failures, unusual data transfers, or changes in file permissions. If the SIEM is going to detect a potential security threat, it can then generate an alert for the security team to come and investigate it. This can also provide us additional detailed information about the threat, such as the source of the attack, the systems or data it's targeting, and the methods it's using to be able to help our security team respond more quickly and more effectively. Now, a Security and Information Event Management System, or SIEM, can also be implemented in a couple of different ways. You can do this as software, hardware appliances, or even as an outsourced managed service when you're using a SIEM. Your SIEM can also be either agent-based or agentless, depending on how you want to collect the log data from all of your network devices and systems across that network. Now, an agent is a small piece of software that's going to be installed on each system, such as a server or workstation, from which the SIEM needs to gather and collect log data. The agent will collect the log data and then send it back to the SIEM system for processing and correlation. This approach provides real-time data collection and can collect more detailed information, but it does require installing and maintaining the software agent on each of those systems. Other SIEMs, though, may rely on what's known as an agentless installation. Under this approach, the SIEM system will directly collect log data from each system using a standard protocol like SNMP or WMI. Now, this approach doesn't require installing any software in the systems, which can reduce your overall maintenance costs. However, it may not provide as detailed of information as an agent-based approach would, and it may not be able to collect data in near real time like you can with an agent-based system. Now, to effectively deploy a SIEM, you have to consider a lot of different things. First, you need to be able to log all the relevant events and filter out anything that is not considered to be relevant because we consider that to be irrelevant data and we don't want to look at it. Second, we need to make sure that we can establish and document the scope of the events inside of our SIEM. Exactly what are we going to be logging and what's going to be considered inside or outside of our scope? Third, we need to develop use cases to define what a threat is. This helps you define exactly what you do and what you do not consider to be a threat, and then what actions you may or may not take based on that threat. This brings us to item number 4, where you need to plan out your incident response actions for a given threat or a given event. Basically, you need to know that when you see this type of thing happening and alerting, what are the actions you want your team to take? That's what we're talking about here. It's the pre-planned responses for any kind of given threat that you may end up facing out in the real world. 5th, we need to establish a ticketing process. That way we could track all these different events that we're flagging. This way, as we go into our SIEM, we may see something that's unusual. Like my example earlier, when we saw somebody logging in from Asia and logging at the local office at the same time, we would say, that looks suspicious, so we will flag it. Now, once we flag it, we need to have some sort of a ticketing system created so we can be able to track it all the way through the process to make sure nobody drops it and it doesn't get forgotten about. 6th, we need to schedule regular threat hunting. Now, by doing this, we want to ensure that we're not missing any important events that may have escaped an alert. By setting up and conducting threat hunting, we're going to be able to catch bad actors doing bad things that may have bypassed our alerts. And finally, we move into our 7th item that we need to consider, which is to provide auditors and analysts an evidence trail. As you probably guessed by now, a SIEM is a centralized repository that has lots of different data, so it becomes a great place for auditors and analysts to look through as they begin to do their analysis for your compliance reports. Now, there's a lot of different SIEM solutions out there, including both commercial and open source varieties that includes things like Splunk, ELK or the Elastic Stack, ArcSight, and QRadar. If you hear any of these names, you should know they have the ability to act as a SIEM. But beyond that, you really don't need to know how to use them or operate them for your exam. Now, like I said, there's a lot of open source tools that make a great addition to your own practice labs and your own home network, because if you're building out your own home network, this will give you the experience with these tools hands-on, which in turn makes you a much better analyst out in the real world. And so that's a reason why it's important to look at these different SIEMs and maybe even play with them in your own network. Now, let's take a look at some of these different SIEMs and understand what they are. First, we have Splunk. Now, Splunk is a market-leading big data information gathering and analyst tool that can import machine-generated data via a connector or a visibility add-on. Now, Splunk is really good at connecting lots of different data systems and sources into one consolidated area. In fact, it has different connectors built for most network operating systems and different application formats as well. Essentially, all the data from all these different systems can be indexed as it's taken off of those systems and then written into a centralized database store using a common format. This allows Splunk to be able to go through all the historical or real-time data and be able to search through all of it using its proprietary search algorithms called the search processing language. Now, once you get those results, you can start visualizing it using different tools. So if you're using Splunk, it looks something like this. Notice here what I have is what looks like a dashboard, and I can see all my important information in one place. I see I have lots of data. I see trends going up or down. I see events over time, and I can actually drill down and click into each one of those by going in and look at the data behind it as well if I need to. Now, Splunk is a really great tool, and it can be installed locally or as a cloud-based solution. When you buy Splunk, it comes with a lot of templates and pre-configured dashboards, as well as security intelligence searches and incident response workflows. Splunk is probably one of the biggest players in the marketplace, and it's a great SIEM for you to consider. Second, we have ELK or the Elastic Stack. Now, ELK or the Elastic Stack is a collection of free and open source SIEM tools that provide storage, search, and analysis functions. Now, with ELK and Elastic Stack, it's actually made up of 4 different components. These are the Elasticsearch, which covers the query and analytics, Logstash, which is your log collection and normalization process, Kibana, which does your visualization, and Beats, which is your endpoint collection agents that are installed on your machines. The way these all work together is that you're going to have different Beats installed on different servers or hosts, and they can then send out either directly things back to Elastic Stack, or it can go into Logstash first. Now, when it goes into Logstash first, it's going to be doing all the parsing and normalization for you, and then it sends it over to the Elasticsearch. If you go directly into Elasticsearch, it has to be in a format that it already understands. Now, Elasticsearch is that centralized data store, and you're really not going to go in and look at Elastic itself to look at the data. Instead, most of the time, you're going to use a visualization tool like Kibana. Kibana goes into Elastic and then visualizes all the data in a way that makes it easy for us to see and understand. Just like Splunk, ELK Stack may be installed locally or as a cloud-based solution. Third, we have ArcSight. Now, ArcSight is a SIEM log management and analytics software that can be used for compliance reporting for legislation and regulations like HIPAA, SOX, and PCI DSS. When you look at ArcSight, it looks a lot like any of the other dashboards I've already shown you, and again, you can drill down into that information and display it in lots of different ways too. Fourth, we have QRadar. Now, QRadar is another SIEM log management, analytics, and compliance reporting platform, but this one was created by IBM. Now, QRadar does a lot of the same stuff we've already talked about, and again, it comes with a really nice looking dashboard. As you look at the dashboard, you get different things that you're going to be looking at, and you can click on those to dive into them and get more details about your network and about your events. Now, in the real world, which of these SIEMs should you use? Well, that depends. Which company are you trying to get a job at, or which company do you already work for? I've worked at a lot of different organizations over the years, and we've used several of these different tools, including Splunk, ElkStack, and ArcSight at different organizations I've worked with. So I've had a lot of experience with a lot of these, and you're probably wondering if one is better than the other, and honestly, it really does depend on your use case. But at the end of the day, you're probably not going to be the one choosing which SIEM to use, and instead the SIEM you're going to use is really going to come down to which one your company is already using, or which one your boss has chosen for your department to use, especially if you're in the entry or mid-level portion of your career. So remember, SIEMs are essential tools in the cybersecurity landscape, since a SIEM is used to provide real-time analysis of your security alerts that are being generated by your applications or network hardware. Your SIEM can either use agent-based or agentless approaches, and there are many examples of SIEMs on the market, including Splunk, Elk or ElasticStack, ArcSight, and QRadar.